Okay, welcome back to this seventh lesson of Should Christians Go to War? We've looked at the material from this book, The Early Christian Attitude to War, but tonight our topic is going to be a little bit different. We're going to go on into looking at the idea of just war, but I want to do a little review and talk a little bit about some history first before we get into that. So far we've seen that the early church was very strict in following the teachings of Jesus, right? They turned the other cheek, they put away their swords, they loved their enemies, they didn't repay evil for evil. This was what the church did for hundreds of years, right? Not everybody, you know. I mean, you don't have to read very far in the New Testament to find out that there weren't very many perfect Christians that were fully mature and doing everything that God told them to do all the time. But this was the view of the church for about 300 years. Now, it was very unusual during that period for a Christian to be a soldier, right? We talked about some of the reasons for that, you know, them being Jews and slaves and exempt in many cases. But from the earliest times, we recognize that there were men in the army who came to Christ, and like guys like Cornelius, the jailer, some soldiers later on. But that was not the usual case, right? Now, as time went on, we get more and more Christians found in the army, right? We get more and more Christians that appear to be fighting just like normal soldiers. They're just alongside their non-Christian counterparts. They're just as brave, just as strong, just, you know, going out on 7 different campaigns or something like that. Even though there might be some prejudice against Christians by some of these generals. We see even around the year 300, there's this massive persecution rolling out against Christians to try to get them out of the army and get back to this pure Roman kind of feeling. But when we look at the writings of the early 3rd century, that's in the 200s, you know, 200 to 250, let's say, we see that it's still more usual for Christians to leave the service, or else, you know, they're in the service, they're doing all this that they can do to avoid violence, to avoid idolatry. There's all sorts of concessions that they have to make, and, you know, dealing with their conscience and all these issues that they're trying to avoid, right? If you're going to stay in, it's kind of difficult. But once you get to the 4th century, right, you get into the time of Constantine, things really start to change. I mean, there's still major Christian writers like Lactantius that are showing that this is not an acceptable path for Christians. But because of Constantine, the persecution has come to an end. You know, the Christians are given a new place. The Christianity is legalized after this great persecution. And over the course of the next century, from 300 to 400, Christianity goes from being this persecuted minority to being the official state religion, right? It didn't take very long, in fact. A lot of people call Constantine the first Christian emperor, but that's not exactly the case. He wasn't baptized until his deathbed. So he gave Christians a lot of credit, gave a lot of favors to Christians and things, but he didn't actually submit to any kind of Christianity himself until the very end. But it's interesting because as the Roman emperor, if you go back in the history, you see that the Roman emperor was in charge of the religions of the state, right? He was kind of the supreme pontiff, kind of like what people would call the Pope today, right? He's the supreme pontiff over the church, over the religion. Well, the emperor was like that. And that's why Constantine was able to call a council, even though he wasn't a bishop or an elder or anything. He had no authority in the church. He was able to call all these church leaders together to decide some things, right? And the Roman emperor really had that authority over Roman religion, over all these different sects that were around at that time. You can even see that, you know, going into with Judaism, the Roman emperor didn't have a lot to do with it, but the king over that area would appoint a new high priest. If you wanted to be high priest, if you had the money, sometimes you could pay the king to make you the high priest. So there was a lot of corruption going on in that kind of area. But Christianity kind of completely changed positions. It became this official state religion. And in that position, right, the government then goes on to enforce teachings of Christianity, right? Whatever the current teachings of the bishops were that had decided these things. So, after about 330, we get to Nicene Christianity, the Council of Nicaea. And so they're able to go around, and if you're a heretic, if you don't agree to this definition of the Trinity or this particular doctrine, well, then you're a heretic, and you might be fined. Your property might be confiscated. You might be prohibited from public gatherings, even private gatherings. Your even pagans, whatever temples you have, those are going to be confiscated. Now, this is over the course of, again, about 150 years, from Constantine on into the middle of the 4th century, that these things are starting to happen. And it gets to the point where there's exile or death. If you're offering pagan sacrifices or something like that, you would be arrested and put to death, or exiled, sent out of the country, or something like that. So the government begins using its power of coercion to enforce these kind of so-called theological truths, right? To kind of establish a doctrine. And the purpose of that, according to the emperors, right, was, well, the church is kind of it's a public utility, right? It's for the public good, because having this universal religion for everybody will ensure harmony and will ensure that everyone's working together and we're all appealing to God in the same way. And so for them, it was kind of a political tool to stabilize the empire. It wasn't so much about going back and, what did Jesus say, but, what are the accepted things that we're laying down here? What's the authority saying? And so we get to the point that things changed so much that by 416 AD, a law was made that all the pagans, if you were, under some pagan rite, basically a Gentile, then you weren't allowed to enlist in the army. You weren't allowed to serve as a judge or an administrator or anything like that. They removed all those people from those positions. I think before I've made a comment that was 411, but my research today showed it's actually 416. Okay, and a lot of this you can go back and you can see this stuff if you look up the Theodosian Code, book number 16. It documents all of the Roman laws from the time of Constantine until Theodosian II in about 450 that are having to do with religion, right? And so, like I said, Christianity became the state religion, and all these rules started coming into place over that time by the various emperors. So what's so odd is, during that time, you've got Christians that are continuing to preach against violence, right? Even today, you've got guys that are saying, you know what, we shouldn't be doing violence. This is not what the church is supposed to do, right? But the official teaching of the church is quite the opposite. It sanctions warfare, right? You've got this alliance, so to speak, between the church and the state, right? I know in the U.S. we like to talk about the separation of church and state. That's kind of one of these modern values, but they didn't have that back in the day, right? The church and the state worked together, right? They were actually kind of trying to control and manipulate each other, right? The church wanted to be independent of the state, but in some ways they wanted the powers of the state, right? And so there's this kind of back and forth between the two. But we see that, atrocities and war in the name of Christ become very commonplace over the next several centuries. These so-called Christians, right? Before, Christians were persecuted, but now it's the Christians that are dragging people through the streets, right? There's a story in 415 AD. The pagan philosopher Hypatia, she was in the city of Alexandria, and a group of Christians came. They kidnapped her. They dragged her naked through the streets. They're cutting her up with pieces of tile, and then they left her in this. They had taken over an old pagan temple or building or something and turned it into a Christian church, but they brought her there and they burned her hands and her feet. She's condemned as a pagan, right? At the same time, There were 500 monks that went and attacked the Roman governor, right? This Roman governor of Alexandria, he had been consulting with Hypatia for some time. She's a philosopher, so he's answering some questions and things, but they accused him, even though he's a Christian, they accused him of paganism, of idolatry, and so they tried to stone him. They weren't successful. I think one of the monks was actually killed or executed because of it. But so you see this struggle, right, between the church and the state. And the church kind of becomes militarized in the 400s, right? And then as you fast forward over the centuries, you get up to around 1252, right? This is kind of in the medieval period. And we see Innocent IV as the Pope. He approves torture to be used now. We want to find out who are the heretics, right? So if someone's accused of heresy, well, you torture them until you can get a confession out of them. And then later, you get some later things. They're even torturing witnesses, right? We want you to tell us what you saw, right? And again, this is exactly what the Romans did a century before, right? I mean, a millennia before. Sorry, in Paul's time, right? That's what they did in the first century. If you were not a Roman citizen, you could be tortured to be told, or not that you committed a crime, but you had witnessed a crime, or they thought you had witnessed a crime. They might torture you to get the evidence out of you. And this was approved by the church, right? What kind of change is that, right? Something is dreadfully wrong, right? Countless wars have been fought between supposed Christian nations, right? The Christian king of France and the Christian king of Spain and the Christian king of England, and et cetera, right? And they go to war and they slaughter each other, right? Now, there were rules for warfare. There were different considerations and things, but so much of it basically comes down to Christians killing Christians. And we have to say, well, how can it be? Of course, there's the Crusades. People love to talk about the Crusades. Some people look back at it as a good thing, but most people see that it was kind of a terrible thing. It made the Muslims very upset, not surprisingly. It cost a tremendous amount of money, a tremendous amount of lives. For hundreds of years, they're sending crusade after crusade to take the Holy Land. We got to recapture Jerusalem. We got to get it back from these guys. But what did they get out of it? Nothing. The only guy that ever captured Jerusalem that way, after a few months, he gave it back to the Muslims and he left. Right? But that was all sanctioned by supposed Christian leaders. It was some kind of holy war. Right? If you look at the budget of Pope John the 22nd, now he's ruling around in the mid-1300s, early 1300s. It's about 700 years ago. Notice war was about 63, almost 64% of his entire budget. Right? Imagine that. The almost 2/3 of all the money coming into the Vatican was being spent on war? Is this the same church that we were talking about in these last 6 lessons? Right? I don't think so. Something has definitely changed. Right? Again, we get into the Inquisition, the numerous Inquisitions, Spanish Inquisition, all these things. Millions of people are going to perish. Why? Because they're accused of being heretics. What's their crime? Well, I don't know. Is it legitimate? Maybe not. Maybe so. But did they deserve the death penalty? Well, show me a death penalty in the New Testament. Right? You're not going to find one in the church. There were some in Israel, right? But we are not Israel, right? We're a different law. So something went dreadfully wrong in the history of Christianity. And it didn't get better when Protestantism came around, right? The Protestant Reformation, whenever there were theological and doctrinal differences, it often led to people being executed. Interestingly, William Tyndale in 1536, this was the first man to ever translate the Greek New Testament into the English language. right? Another guy a couple hundred years before him had translated it from Latin into English. John Wycliffe. But now Tyndale had done it, but it wasn't authorized by the church. It wasn't authorized by the king. So you weren't supposed to translate the Bible into the, quote, vulgar tongues, into the languages of the common people, right? It needed to be in Latin, right, where no one could actually read it except the priests. And so Tyndale was actually betrayed to the Catholic authorities. They condemned him as a heretic, and they strangled him to death, tied to a stake, and burned his dead body, right? For what? For making the Bible where people could read it. That was his crime. Then John Calvin, famous reformer of in Switzerland, right? He had an opponent named Michael Servetus. You might call him an opponent. I don't know that Servetus would have thought of Calvin as an opponent necessarily, but Servetus kind of criticized some of the things that Calvin had written in his Institutes of Christian Religion, and Calvin didn't like that very much, and so he turned him over to the authorities in Geneva, and he was eventually burned to death over a pile of his own books because he supposedly denied the Trinity and infant baptism. So, I mean, people like us would have been killed, right? Not to say that we deny the Trinity necessarily, but if your version of the Trinity is even a little bit different, if your conception of God is any different than the probably not even the Nicene Creed or the Constantinopolitan Creed, but the Chalcedonian Creed or whatever creed they were following at the time, if you said anything different, well, you're a heretic, right? So you could be dead. Lutherans killed Anabaptists. English rulers executed many Roman Catholics, sometimes for treason and other things because they were faithful to the Pope and not to the king, supposedly. Even when you get to the United States, right? So into the New World, Quakers who had fled religious persecution and Puritans who had also fled religious persecution are now persecuting each other in the States. And Puritans killed Quakers in Massachusetts, burned some of them as witches because they didn't believe the same things as them. And so we have to wonder, what is going on with Christianity? Is this what God created, right? Is this what Jesus wanted us to have, right? Clearly, I think none of this death and destruction is sanctioned in the teachings of Jesus, in the teachings of the apostles, right? Something very wrong has happened. The corrupting power of the state had turned much of the church against its earlier principles, and that just spread out into each denomination and each group, and where they were able to hold on to power in a particular place, bad things tended to happen, right? So that's just kind of a summary of the history of things, what happened once the church abandoned her nonviolent principles. In many cases, she turned on herself, right? And Christians put Christians to death more than anybody else. And that's a big problem, right? And that goes to show why maybe we need to rethink some of this, right? But our lesson for today, we really want to get into this just war theory, right? And talk about this idea. So let's take a little bit and go through some of the history of it. The just war theory started back in the time of Aristotle, right? The Greek philosopher. So he's back in the 300s. This is 300 years before Christ. Aristotle is the first one we know of to use the phrase just war. Obviously, it would have been in Greek, not in English, but that's beside the point. Now, a lot of philosophers talked about it. There was a Roman philosopher named Cicero that had a lot to say about it sometime after Aristotle, a century or two later. But it was a non-Christian topic, right? They're trying to establish what's the ethical standards for warfare that we should have, right? Is warfare just, as they say, all's fair in love and war, or is it just, do we need some rules, right? That there are good wars and bad wars, right? So, I mean, that's an important discussion to have, right? If you're a philosopher, you can understand that, right? If you're a nation, you might want to know, should we do this or not, right? What's leading our decisions? I'm good with having this theory, right? Whether I subscribe to it or not. Now, the first Christians that really discussed this sort of theory, and it's not as a theory per se, right? They're just explaining their views about warfare. But we've got guys like Ambrose and his disciple Augustine, right? So notice the dates on that. Ambrose was born around AD 340, right? Died AD 397. Augustine died AD 430, right? So when Augustine's writing, he's writing at a point where Christianity is the only religion that's allowed, right? Everyone else is being fined and exiled and confiscated and banned, right? It's the religion of the empire, right? It is the religion of the state. And so that's a very different position than it had been 100 years before. But it's interesting, though, when you look at their writings, right? Ambrose and Augustine, who are talking about the possibility of just war, talking about how it works, neither one of those men believed that a Christian could even kill in self-defense, right? If we look at what Ambrose says here, it says, "I do not think that a Christian ought to save his own life by the death of another, just as when he meets an armed robber he cannot return his blows, lest in defending his life he should stain his love toward his neighbor." Think about that, right? So here are these guys saying, no, a Christian cannot defend himself, right? You can't kill someone in self-defense. That is not allowed for a Christian. I mean, that's it shouldn't happen. That's what he's saying, right? But yet he is talking about a just war. So where does that change come in, right? Well, Augustine believed that there were two kingdoms, right? There was the kingdom of God and the kingdom of the pagans, right? And he writes a series, he writes a lot of things about the city of God, and he's talking about these two kingdoms and contrasting them, right? And so this is what he gets the idea that all of the evils of war, they're to be found in the kingdom of the pagans, right? And he actually says that even the peace, right? These other nations, he puts them all together, into the basically not God camp. So you got God's camp and the world, right? And he says basically the world is, they fight for peace, but the peace that they want is an unjust peace. They don't want God's peace. They want their domination of someone else, right? They want their control. And that's not fair, right? That's not a just peace. They're just enforcing their own ideas, their own thinking. They're not doing it because of what God said. Now, Augustine believed that if God commanded a war, like in the Old Testament, then a war like that could not possibly be sinful, right? Because God can't sin. He can't tell you to sin. If he tells you to do it, it's okay. And, I agree with him, I think. I think when God commands you to do something, you do it, right? Abraham was commanded to kill his son. Under all normal circumstances, that would be an abominable thing. But God told you to do it, so you do it, right? Now, God stopped him at the last moment. So maybe that should give us something to think about too. Even if God commands us to go to war, maybe he might say stop at the last moment. We don't know, right? But some of it rests on this question, well, how do you know that God is commanding you to go to war, right? But anyway, he understood there's a chance that war is not sinful, right? But God also never changes, right? So if God used war in the Old Testament, right, it was allowed, it was commanded. Well, God's the same. He doesn't change. So it must still be allowed and maybe even commanded in the New Testament, right? In this new, because it's the same kingdom of God versus the kingdom of the pagans in Augustine's thinking. But he did say war should only be fought when it's necessary to preserve the peace, right? You don't just fight wars just because you want to, right? There are some conditions under which war can be fought, and one of them is, when it's necessary, right? We need this to have peace. And so he recognized, though, that wars were only waged because of sin, right? someone has done wrong, and so we go to war to stop the wrong, right? Sin is all around us. Sin causes lots of problems, and so war is not. Sin is the cause of war, basically, is what he's saying. And he's saying we should weep for that sin, right? That sin is something that we should lament about. He says here, the wise man will wage just wars, right? As if he would not all the rather lament the necessity of just wars, if he remembers that he is a man. For if they were not just, he would not wage them, and would therefore be delivered from all wars. For it is the wrongdoing of the opposing party which compels the wise men to wage just wars, and this wrongdoing would still be a matter of grief to man, because it is man's wrongdoing. Let everyone then, who thinks with pain on all these great evils, so horrible, so ruthless, acknowledge that this is misery. All right, so this is from City of God, book 19, section 7. But look at that. The wise man will wage just wars, right? He says, if the wars weren't just, he wouldn't wage them. I think we need to come back to that a little bit later, right? If the war were not just, he would not wage them, right? That's the requirement here, right? It has to be fair, right? You're opposing this wrongdoing. You do that. He says, if you wouldn't wage this war, then you would be delivered from all wars, right? The wise man wouldn't be involved. But the sin is there. You're working against this wrongdoing, right? And it's so evil. This is bad, right? We all acknowledge war is bad. It has bad causes. Even trying to fight against it can lead to even worse things. But basically, he saw that it was the duty of the state to preserve the peace and stop wrongdoing, right? So this idea, this is not just about the individual, right? And so we can see how Augustine would say that, a person of himself shouldn't defend himself, shouldn't take someone's life in that regard, right? He needs to turn the other cheek, he needs to do that. But it's the job of the state to do these things, right? To ensure that there's peace. Now, again, he lived in a time when the emperors were now Christian, right? Constantine wasn't really the first emperor that was a Christian. He was later. We got Theodosius I in the mid to late 300s. And now we've got, I don't remember who was the emperor when Constantine wrote this exactly, or when Augustine wrote this. But he points out there have been Christian emperors, right? And so his thinking is that these guys are fighting wars. They have the authority of God behind them because they're the emperor, right? And the church is the kingdom of God. And what kingdom is greater than that, right? So if the authority for going to war is in, the sovereign authority of the state, well, the church is the state in Augustine's mind. The church is its own kingdom. It's greater than all these worldly kingdoms. So who has more authority than the church to do that? And you see how different that is than what we've been studying for the last several weeks, right? Very different interpretation of things, right? Because before this, the Christians weren't in charge, right? And so it wasn't a question of that, right? Christians just didn't do this. Now, okay, so we see a need, right, for the state to go preserve the peace, to stop wrongdoing, to do these kinds of things. But what about the individual soldier, right? A Christian can't defend himself, but how are you going to, if you're not supposed to defend yourself, well, how are you going to fight for a king or for something like that? He goes in his book against Faustus. He says, a righteous man serving under an ungodly king may do the duty belonging to his position in the state in fighting by the order of his sovereign. For in some cases it is plainly the will of God that he should fight, and in others, where this is not so plain, it may be an unrighteous command on the part of the king, while the soldier is innocent because his position makes his obedience a duty. How much more must the man be blameless who carries on war on the authority of God, of whom every one who serves him knows he can never require what is wrong? Now, I agree with that last statement there, right? If you're carrying on a war on the authority of God, then good, right? If God commanded the Israelites to go in and destroy the Canaanites, he was sending them in there to destroy the Canaanites because they had been wicked, right? That was God's just punishment on the Canaanites, administered through his people, right? And they had that command. The question is, do we have that command, right? God hasn't changed, but his instructions to us have changed, right? God still uses the nations of the world to punish evil, right? But does God use the people of the church to punish evil, right? That's the question. And I think we've seen 3 centuries of evidence that he didn't. But now we're getting something else. And so there's this kind of inconsistency here, right? That even though the command might be unrighteous, right? You've got a king that he's not waging a just war. But the soldier's just innocent because he's just doing his duty. Is that right? Right? Here's the problem. Is a soldier innocent just because he's dutifully obeying his superiors? Do we believe that? I know sometimes that's used as a defense, right? I was just following orders. But on the other hand, you question that, right? I think if you go back and you look at some of these things from World War II with the Nazis, right, and these Nuremberg trials and all of that, just following orders was not a legitimate defense. Because there are some things where you should say, hey, wait a second, this is not right, right? Now, a military doesn't want their soldiers doing that, right? You don't want your soldiers questioning orders in the middle of battle, right? Because that leads to disorder, and that can cause other problems, right? You can't depend on that unit because, well, what if they're not going to do it, right? So you want people to just follow orders and do it. But is that how we're supposed to operate as Christians, right? If we've been commanded by God to love our enemies, right? Not to violently resist evil, not to repay evil with evil, we've been commanded to put down the sword, right? To turn the other cheek, right? Well, what are we supposed to do? Well, I think Peter tells us we must obey God rather than men. Does that only apply to preaching? Or does that apply to every aspect of our life? Right? Jesus says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. Okay, I'll give you the money because your face is stamped on it and your inscription, right? But my body, my service is to God, not to the state, right? We submit to the state as much as we can, but when that submission goes against God, well, we can't do it, right? If you're in the army and they tell you to offer sacrifices to this guy, or you're a slave and do this, does you just do it, you dutifully obey because you're a slave, you don't have any control? No, that's not how it works. So the teaching of Augustine on this point really is contrary to everything that we've seen so far in our study of early Christianity, right? He has brought in something new, right? Maybe from his Greek philosophy or something, maybe just from his understanding as thinking this is good, right? That we have these Christian emperors that are preserving these things and doing this. I'm not quite sure about all of that, but clearly it's different than what we've been looking at, right? And so we have to ask this question, how can our first duty be to a commanding officer and not to Christ, right? I think that's a big problem, right? If Christ has commanded us some certain things that we're supposed to do, and we're supposed to be priests of God, that we're supposed to be ministers of reconciliation, how can we be fighting for our country or for our king or whatever and killing people? I don't see how it can be done. Well, let's put that aside for a minute, okay? Let's look at just war theory, just the merits of it by itself, right? How did it kind of develop, right? So Augustine's got some thoughts that are sort of based on the thoughts of Ambrose and Cicero and Aristotle before him, right? But he wasn't the last one to say anything about it. Lots of philosophers since him, Christians and otherwise, have gone on to expand on this idea. One very popular one is Thomas Aquinas. You may have heard of him before. He was a Catholic doctor back in the 1300s, and a whole bunch of doctrines and teachings came from him. And he kind of really elaborated on this idea of just war. And since then, people have gone on to refine it and think more about it. Because the point is, regardless of what you think about it, right, and how much you think it applies to Christians, right, it's a good framework to have, right? Because it's trying to constrain the evils of war. We're trying to figure out, should we do this? What are some things that we should avoid? How can we minimize the evil of this very terrible thing, right? And so it's a good thing to think about, right? And you could contribute to that as a Christian. Even if you don't think Christians should go to war, you could tell other people, how you think they should deal with their problems, right? And so it's helpful. Now, we could say a lot about it, and there's a whole lot more. I read some things this last week, long things, long discussions about this. There's whole books that have been written about it. And it is a very valuable ethical study, right? But we'll kind of go through a little overview of the criteria and discuss a few points. So there are 7 or 8 major criteria that are established for just war. Now, different people might phrase them differently or arrange them in slightly different ways, right? But it's basically a way to figure out. We look at these things and we can see how just is this. Can we justify going to war? Some of them have to do with going to war in the first place, right? Should we even start a war? And then other ones have to do with how are we actually going to fight the war? How will it be accomplished? What ways will we do that? And there's some, we didn't get into it right now, but there are even people that have gone on to talk about the aftermath of war and how you deal with the end of the war, how you treat your former enemies and things, because that determines whether it was just or not too, right? I mean, you could conceivably have a just cause and go and fight in a really terrible way and then treat the people really badly afterwards, even after they've given up. And then even though you had a good reason, it wasn't a just war. Or maybe you had a really bad reason, but you fought very fair. Does that, you can see how there's different ways. You could have a good reason, you could fight very fair, and then you could treat people terrible at the end after you win, and so it's still not just, right? So there are a lot of considerations to make in that, and man, we could talk about that for hours. There's a lot of difficulty interpreting the different criteria, implementing the different criteria. But again, I mean, if we're talking about ethics and the study of ethics, which is what just war is, it's complicated, right? And it's supposed to be complicated because you're supposed to spend a lot of time thinking about it so that you make good decisions, right? That's kind of the whole point, that everyone can put in their input and, we can avoid as much conflict as possible. So if we talk about the criteria, the first criteria is just cause, right? Is the cause that we're fighting for fair and just, right? And most people agree that self-defense is a just cause, right? If someone is attacking you, you have the right to defend yourself. Now, again, this is not individuals, right? We're talking about warfare. We're talking about nations, mostly. So if one nation attacks another, that nation has the right to defend itself. That's fair. Okay. What if somebody attacks your neighbor, right? A neighboring country. Well, maybe you want to go to defense for them because they need to be protected. Or what if there's another country that is mistreating its citizens, right? That's a good question, right? Can we go and try to rescue them, right? That might be a just cause. Maybe someone took over part of your territory and you're taking it back, right? That could be considered a just cause. Now, there are reasons why some of those might not work, right? You get down into the specifics, it gets a lot more complicated. But basically, those are sort of considered as just causes for the most part. The second criteria is to have a right authority, right? That it's a legitimate government that's going to war. So this is not for individuals. This rules out, most kind of revolutions and things like that. You need to be a sovereign government. That's kind of the thought. Now, there are some exceptions, you might say, right? Because, well, what about a revolution? What if the legitimate government is so corrupt and so tyrannical? You imagine North Korea or something where the people are just suffering and all these things. How are we going to fix that problem, right? Will the people rise up and create some group and fight against it, right? Is that allowed? And most of these just war theorists, as you get later on, they make allowances for a kind of a revolution, right? If the situation is particularly bad. But again, it's this balance, right? Is it really just or is it not? And you might think of some examples, like I think of the United States of America, right? We fought the Revolutionary War against the British. Why? Well, because they were taxing us a little bit, maybe a lot, but maybe not really very much. Is that a good enough reason to declare your independence and start a bloody war that lasts for years because you didn't want to pay some taxes? Now, that's not the only reason, right? They were also forcing soldiers to stay in, forcing people to accept soldiers in their homes and a bunch of other things. There were a lot of insults. But whether the king was really a tyrant or not is maybe up for debate. He wasn't just murdering colonists left and right. So there's this question, was the Revolutionary War a just war, right? Or is, the country that I'm from founded on totally unjust causes? Whatever we might say, right? It's a tricky question, right? But there were a lot of Christians in that time that thought it was the right thing to do, right? And there were a lot that thought it was the wrong thing to do. But it is what happened. Another one is for right intention, right? And this is related to just cause, right? But it goes on a little bit more. So maybe right intention, you can't do it for economic gain, right? You can't just say, well, we want these resources, right? Or we're expanding our country, we're expanding our empire, right? That's not a just reason, right? And so that kind of makes me think again of the United States. People we have this manifest destiny. We're going to spread all the way from the Atlantic. We're going to get all the way to the Pacific and take over all this land that didn't belong to us, right? That we supposedly bought from the French and from the Spanish and from whoever. And we went in and just kind of took over this land that, yeah, there were Indians living there, but they didn't have houses like us. Or they sold it to us for a handful of beads, And you got to think, I don't know that that's legitimate, The more you think about these just war things, the less things look good for my country in the past and in the not too recent past as well. Anyway, right intention is one of the criteria, right? You can't just go to war for whatever reason that you want. Then there has to be a reasonable chance of success, right? This is another one, right? If war is a terrible thing, we want to avoid conflict, right? So if you can't win, right? So, say you see a neighboring country that's being invaded or something like that, right? Are you going to go to their aid and protect them? Well, what if the country that's taking them over is so powerful that you have no chance of winning, right? Well, you should just give up, right? You should not do that because there's just going to be lives lost for no reason, right? You're going to increase a war or start a war that didn't need to be started. Better maybe to just surrender and bide your time. Maybe there's another way you can get out. that kind of leads to the last one, last resort, right? This is not the last one, but you've done everything else necessary, right? You're trying to maintain peace at all costs, right? So, okay, maybe we can have some negotiations. Maybe I can pay you something, right? Like a tribute or something, or might have some sort of arrangement or trade agreement, or I might give you some of our land, or we might share something, or I might. There's all sorts of things, right? All these negotiations. You might put sanctions on other countries. That's a common thing right now. In the United Nations or something, they put sanctions on Iran or North Korea where they can't trade with other countries because they don't want to start a war, right? But they want to prevent them from getting nuclear weapons or something like that, right? So, diplomacy is involved, right? But if all of those possibilities are exhausted, then the idea that is, at a last resort, we've got to go to war to preserve the peace or to restore the peace, right? That's the idea. Then there's number 6, proportionate means. So this is where you use just enough force to secure peace, right? This one is one that's often used to kind of rule out the use of nuclear weapons, right? If someone insults you or attacks you, just going in and slaughtering a village or something like that, that's not really proportionate means. I mean, we could go, for instance, you could go in the Bible, go back to the story of Jacob and his sons, right? And when his daughter Dinah was violated in Shechem, right, by the prince there, Shechem. And what happened is the brothers, when Shechem came to ask for Dinah as a wife, they tricked them and got them all to be circumcised, and then they went in and killed the whole town, right? And their dad is like, what did you do? You just slaughtered a whole town of men. These other people around are gonna, they're gonna cause problems. And their response was, well, should we have treated our sister as a prostitute, right, and just sold her to these guys? Like, there's nothing in between treating your sister like a prostitute and slaughtering an entire village, right? I think there's a lot of, opportunity in there for doing something else. That's very disproportionate means. You know what I mean? So you want to use just enough force. If someone takes over some territory, you're just taking back that territory. You're not trying to expand into more territory. You're not going in and nuking the place or dropping carpet bombs and drone strike, doing all sorts of stuff, far beyond what you need to do. You just have enough of a deterrent, right? Maybe if someone's going to attack you, you don't have to attack them. You just have to say, look, we put in this wall. Now we have a wall, right? Or now we have a missile battery here to shoot the rock. Like Israel, they've got their Iron Dome. Because the Palestinians are shooting rockets, well, we'll make something to shoot your rockets out of the sky, right? We don't have to go to war against you necessarily. We're just going to defend our people, right? So that would be a kind of proportionate means kind of thing. It would be unjust if someone launches one rocket at you to just launch 50 rockets back and just blow up the whole countryside, right? I think we understand that pretty well. And then last is non-combatant immunity, right? So the idea that non-combatants, particularly civilians, should not be targeted in warfare, right? They're off limits. That's the idea of that one. So if you can tick off all these boxes, right, then you might say, okay, then we've got a just war, right? If we've got a just cause and it's the right authority that's doing it, and we have the right intention, and we have a reasonable chance of success, and we've exhausted all our other, possibilities, and we're using just the right amount of force, and we're not going to hurt any non-combatants or civilians, then that's a just war, or as near as you're going to get to it, right? But the question is it just, right? How do some of these things work? Right? We talked about the right authority. Well, what if there's a revolution, right? That's not a right authority. So all revolutions are unjust. But we said, well, we want to make an exception for some of them. Well, how do you know who's the exception, right? A reasonable chance of success. There's a lot of times where the little guy ends up winning, right? His chance of success was almost nothing. But it was that or die, or that or be enslaved, or something like that. And so they fought and they did it, right? But by this criteria, if they don't have much chance of success, it's not fair for them to fight. It's not a just war. So in some of these don't quite make sense, right? And then the last resort. That's the big question, right? How many times is it really the last resort, right? There's a lot of things now, especially when people are making preemptive strikes, right? Because one of the things with just cause, someone might say, well, you can defend yourself against an attack, or if you know an attack is imminent, maybe you can go ahead and make a preemptive strike to defend yourself against that attack. And you're like, well, that's clearly not the last resort, right? If that's the first thing that you do, then that's not the last resort. That's exactly the opposite of the last resort, right? So a preemptive strike is exactly the opposite of that. So there's a problem with that. So how do we define some of these things? And then, of course, non-combatant immunity. By the way, this list came from a book called Fight by Preston Sprinkle. If you guys want to look into that a little bit, you can get it on maybe Amazon or something, an ebook. Fight by Preston Sprinkle. It's in his appendix talking about just war. But he makes a point in there, and I'd like to read a little bit of it here. Talking about non-combatant immunity, right? He says, this one's the one that troubles me most, the one that has done little to create justice in war. Right, we talk about it, but it gets ignored. He says, it's war. Civilians get massacred. That's just the way it is. He says, but what I find most troubling is that the number of civilian casualties keeps getting higher. In World War I, 1/5 of all deaths were civilians. In World War II, the number rose to 2/3. In the recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the percentage has been estimated as high as 90%. That's 9 civilians murdered for every combatant. Now, in raw numbers, of course, there are a lot more civilians that died in World War II than in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? But think about that. The number of kind of collateral damage, right? Because what are they doing? A lot of these things are now they're sending in drone strikes. You know, we see a terrorist in there, and we're going to launch in a drone and blow them up, right? Now, what if there's innocent people around? Well, you know, that's collateral damage. We try to minimize it, but it's, you know, we're not really holding to the non-combatant immunity thing, right? And again, a lot of times this is my country. It's really sad. And I don't think a lot of people don't think about it very much. You know, again, it's kind of the victor writes the history books, right? We think, oh yeah, we're taking out terrorists. Well, Preston in his book gives another example. He says, imagine that Mexico, right? Mexico is having a problem with drugs, right? They're having, these drug lords in the United States that are buying these drugs, and they're sending this money back, and they're funding all these things. They have a problem with these cartels. And so what if Mexico were to get some information about some guys living in the U.S., and they're like, these guys are causing a lot of trouble in our country. We need to take them out. And so they launch a couple of missiles into San Diego or Los Angeles, California, and, kill 50 people, but they take out this drug lord. right? Does that sound good? It's one thing when we think about, oh, we're taking out terrorists in the Middle East, right? And yeah, 10 or 15 civilians died, but that doesn't really make the news, right? But if that happened in your own country, wow, something's not right here. And somebody's firing that rocket, right? And somebody's supporting this, right? What is our stance on it as Christians today, right? Again, if we're going back to the teachings of Christ and all this, we're just going to have to say, no, that's not good. But even if we're using this just war criteria, we're saying, that's still not sounding very good. He gives another example. He looks at the Iraq War, right? Back in Desert Storm. You guys might, I don't know if you remember it, back in the early 90s. The former President Bush attacked Iraq because Iraq had invaded Kuwait, right? And so he says, consider Desert Storm. America seemed to satisfy most of the just war criteria. They had just cause and limited objectives, right? They're going to war. They're going to free Kuwait, right? The probability of success was high, right? Negotiations weren't going to be effective. He said, but two criteria were violated. Many civilians were killed, and the U.S. military carpet bombed the Iraqi army as it was fleeing from Kuwait, right? So they violated the Non-Combatant Immunity. They violated Proportionate Means. So they got a 5 out of 7, right? Well, he says, but how about the Iraq War, right? Iraq itself invaded Kuwait. Iraq was a legitimate authority, right? They're an actual nation. They believed they had a just cause because Kuwait used to be part of Iraq. They were reclaiming their rightful territory. They used proportionate means. They had a reasonable chance of success. The war was a last resort because there was no chance of negotiation, but some non-combatants were killed. So Iraq got a 6 out of 7. So by these just war criteria, the nation of Iraq attacking Kuwait was more just than the United States attacking Iraq to free Kuwait. Right? And so if one of those is more just than the other, right, and the least just one is trying to correct the more just one, then that means that that whole war was not just. And if you participated in it, well, that's a big problem, right? Well, really, the point of these are not to establish some scientific test to see if a war is just or not, right? In fact, just war advocate, am I getting? Trying to get my thing here. It's not coming up. Just a minute. Got to kill the slide and bring it back. Let me get it back here. All right, guys. Don't know what happened on that. It's my last slide, though. Just war advocate Oliver O'Donovan. He wrote History Knows of No Just Wars. Right? There's not one. War's evil. Everyone agrees to that. It might be more just than something else, but is it really just the whole thing considered from start to finish? Not really. Right? And so these criteria, they're meant to lessen the evils of war, right? But in reality, a lot of times they get ignored. And the authorities or whoever it is, they go to war for their own purposes, right? And whoever wins, well, you get to write the history books. And you get to justify your actions after the fact. But in reality, just war advocates and nonviolence advocates, they're not very far apart. right? They're not very far apart. The main disagreement is really this question of last resort, right? If you think it's the last resort, if you think it's available and you can do it, okay, then you do it. You're going to do it sometime. But if you don't think that you can go to war even as a last resort, then you're not going to go to war, right? And notice that history knows no just wars. Go back to what Augustine said before, right? He said that the wise man will wage just wars, right? If the war wasn't just, he wouldn't wage it. He would not have part in any war. So then we have to ask, wait a second. If there's no just war, then there's no war that we can be a part of, right? Because every one of them is sin. Now, if you're in Augustine's point of view and, God has commanded, the sovereign ruler of the Christians here to do this, or that the Christians can wage a holy war because the church is the greatest thing, well, okay then. But again, that goes against everything that we learned about the church in the last six lessons, right? That's not what the church did. That was a new idea. And so we got to be careful, right? But again, either way, we want to promote nonviolence, right? We want to promote good ways of resolving conflict and getting around these things. So that's the idea of just war. And so I'm going to turn this presentation off for a second. And then I guess that'll be it, unless we've got some questions.